I picked this topic because I thought it was especially germane given all the events that are going on in America these days. So, trias politica is also known as separation of powers. The first time the term was actually used was by Montesquieu back in 1748 when he referred to a tripartite system. And one of the things that he was adamant about was that there's this separation of the judiciary from the other branches, and that, as he said, the independence of the judiciary has to be real and not merely apparent. So it has to be real, and we'll talk more about this in a few minutes when I talk about the judiciary. The key was that the judiciary was generally seen as the most powerful because of the checks and balances system and the way our systems were designed. So when I talk about separation of powers in the United States, there's a whole long history I could give about how it evolved, but I just want to talk about it and talk about the fact that it also applies on the state level as well as it does on the federal level. We have an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch. I want to talk about each one of those and some of the powers. So the legislative branch, we actually have what's called the House of Congress, which is bicameral, which means two houses, and it is directly related as opposed to the executive branch, which is not directly related, and as opposed to the judiciary branch, which is actually appointed. So not only do we have three different powers, but they're all come to be in different ways. The House of Congress is made up of two branches. One is the Senate. There's two senators from each state. They're elected for a term of 6 years, and they're basically designed to turn around every 3 years, 1/3 are turned around every 2 years or so. The other branch is the Congress, 435 members who are elected to a 2-year term. What do? Well, their powers are fairly broad. They can pass bills and they create laws, hence the name legislative. They are responsible for taxation, for creating taxation. They regulate interstate commerce. They can borrow money. Nobody else can, but the Congress can. They have the sole power to declare war. They ratify treaties. And they also have two other important powers, the power of impeachment. And most people think of impeachment as impeaching the president, but in reality, they can impeach the president, the vice president, any other federally elected official, and judges. And it actually is a two-part process. The Congress actually invokes articles of impeachment, and then the Senate actually holds a trial. And the person to be convicted of a high crimes and misdemeanors has to be convicted by 2/3 of the Senate. And then advice and consent. You've heard a lot about this lately. The president has nominated people for different positions, and so there's a huge argument about whether they should be appointed or shouldn't be appointed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and the role that that takes. The judiciary was created by the 3rd article of the Constitution, which actually created a Supreme Court. It did not create the others. It gave the powers to create other courts to the Congress. So the Congress actually has the power to create the court system, and they created a 3-level system: the district court, the appellate court, and the Supreme. All right, so we have a district level courts, goes to the appellate court, and so on. Federal judges are actually appointed by the president, and this is something that maybe not everyone knows, but is important. They're confirmed by the Senate, although they're appointed by the president, or not confirmed by the Senate, as the case may be, and they serve until they resign, retire, die, or impeached. So they are essentially appointed for life. And the purpose for this was to give them freedom to make decisions without political power being forced upon them. The judiciary has broad powers as well and checks the Congress and the president in many cases. They determine which laws Congress intended to apply to any given case, so they get to decide that. They exercise judicial review regarding the constitutionality of laws. Is this a constitutionally valid law or not? And they can strike down laws if they want to. They determine how Congress meant the law to apply. So Congress gets to make the law, but then the judiciary gets to say, well, here's how we think that you meant for that to apply. And they determine how laws should be interpreted in a top-down fashion so that the law is performed at the district level, then can go to the appellate level, and then goes up to the Supreme Court. And we've seen this many times. The executive branch, it is not directly related. Big brouhaha when the president was elected about the Electoral College. That was designed by the founders in the Constitution to create an electoral college to elect the president. They did not want direct representation. They understood that. Senate and Congress are directly elected, but they did not want the president and vice president to have that. The citizens elect essentially a slate of electors on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November, which we commonly refer to as Election Day. And then a month later, on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December, they actually elect the president. So that's when we actually elect the president and vice president. The executive branch, the president and vice president have to receive an absolute majority in order to be elected. The executive branch also has very broad powers, which need to be kept in check and which keep the others in check. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He or she executes the instructions of Congress. They may veto bills by Congress, but those vetoes may in turn be overridden. So again, it's wonderful systems of checks and balances. They execute the spending authorized by Congress or not execute it. For example, President Obama sent $221 million to the Palestinians the last few days of his reign, and the current administration decided not to send that money, and they have the power to do that, to execute or not execute that. They declare states of emergencies, they make executive agreements, and they make appointments to the federal judiciary and federal departments. In other words, cabinet members. And we've talked again, there's a lot of news lately about federal appointees to cabinet positions. So the separation of power, the concept is to have a series of checks and balances to make sure that no one branch of our government gets out of control, that no one branch has more power than the others, that it is essentially equal. Congress, for example, can define the judiciary, and they could, for example, decide that they want 7 members on the Supreme Court, or 11 members, or 5, or 47. They could do that. But the judiciary also has the opportunity to interpret or forbid laws and limit laws passed by Congress. The president is commander-in-chief, but only Congress can actually declare war. So again, we have these series of checks and balances. This is important, this isn't germane, because of all the arguments that have been going on lately about what's going on in terms of separation of power. It's very important for our society that we continue these checks and balances. Bipartisanship destroys this. If you listen to the news today, you'll find out the Secretary of Education was elected by 51-50 vote. Essentially, it was bipartisan all the way. All the Democrats voted against it. All but 2 Republicans voted in favor of it, and the Vice President had to break the tie. This destroys the balance of power. If you look, Democrats are consistently voting all in a block. Republicans are consistently voting all in a block. This was not how it was meant to be. Right? And it helps destroy the checks and balances. Partisanship judges destroy this. When people are appointed to the federal court or the Supreme Court, and they make political decisions instead of judicial decisions, that hurts the checks and balances. An abuse of executive orders and executive power destroys this. And so all of us need to be aware of this and to introduce more civil discourse into discussions about these sort of things. I tell my friends on Facebook, we need to be vigilant, but not vigilantes. Right? The concept of having all this violence that's going on and people trying to destroy the system. We have a system that's existed for 240 years. If we make it work, it could work for another 240 years. Thank you. Are you going to be using?
No.